My name is Richard Blackburn, and as long as I can remember that, then I know I have a past before all this started. I had a mother and a father, and even though I can't remember their names, I can recall their faces. Before this madness began, I led a normal life, complete with a wife and kids and a home mortgage I could barely afford. I know I've lived in Denver, Colorado, Seattle, Washington, and finally in Marienfeld, Texas. I'm pretty sure I was born in the summer of 1980, but I can't remember the actual date. I must have some medical training. I can tie a one-handed stitch with ease, but don't remember how or when I learned. The funny thing about what's happening to my mind is that I don't remember specifics, but functional knowledge is still there. One of the few things I do remember is that I'm a pilot. I guess that's because it was something which meant a lot to me. Or perhaps it was because it was while executing my duties as a captain that I got trapped in this hell. I'm writing this on the suggestion of a friend I recently made, so I can have a clear memory of what has happened. He believes that by writing as much down as I can, and then studying the journal frequently, it may aid my memory. I doubt very much that it will do anything to improve my mind, but I am willing to try. Also, if I should be torn limb from limb, then at least some part of me will remain in my writings, and there is a slight chance that someone will find these journals and know I existed. I've been traveling so long now, and my long-term memory seems to worsen with each new place. Perhaps memories are rooted not in the mind, but in the places that they're made. And the farther I get from my world, the less I can discern of them. I can only describe my memory as like when you're listening to a radio station on a long drive, and the signal gets worse and worse. That's my memory. The static is getting harder to listen through. I think all my memories are still there, I just can't get to them because of all the interference. But I may be wrong, they may be gone, or maybe they're not mine at all. The panic of losing my mind and watching myself dissolve into a person without a history is intolerable. Each transition costs me a little more of who I was. Each time I hear it, I know part of me will die. At first, it sounds like the waves of a faraway ocean lapping against a beach. So distant. I can barely hear it when it starts, but the closer it gets to the moment, the louder it gets. This morning I heard the waves again, and I know in a couple of days or less, it will sound like an angry dog trying to scratch its way into my skull. Finally, when I don't think I can live with it anymore, when the thought of killing myself seems preferable to bearing the deafening cacophony growing in my ears, I will find myself in some place different again. A short while after that, I will find myself being hunted. I think when it gets frustrated that it hasn't been able to rend my flesh, it changes the scenery. Although it might be trapped in the cycle with me, just as helpless as to the where and when as I am. I feel like I'm a fish being taken from tank to tank by a psychotic pet store owner. Each time I grow accustomed to a place, each time I think I'm safe, it comes. It always comes. The fetid stench of its flesh causing me to gag on the air I breathe. Every time it comes, I run. I think it knows I'm not from these places, and it is trying to balance the cosmic scales by slaughtering me. I know it's the same one. It has the scar I gave it on our first encounter. I am one of the few damned who have their own personal demon. Enough existential conjecture. Now I will endeavor to tell my story from the start. As I mentioned, I'm a pilot, and I believe I know exactly when all this began. That damned flight and the sensuous and impossible light. I touched it. I felt it vibrate in my bones, from my hand into my wrist, then like an electric current through the rest of my body. If you've ever touched a 9-volt battery to your tongue, then you have a notion as to what I'm describing. That sensation crawling inside and outside your skin. But I've gotten ahead of myself, and I must make an effort to write this in a coherent fashion. I'll try to tell the events in chronological order without speculative narrative and allow you, the reader, to draw your own conclusions. The last flight I made as a sane man was from Marienfeld, Texas to Thermal, California. It was at night, and it was the second time I saw St. Elmo's fire, or so I thought. St. Elmo's fire is nothing more than an electrostatic buildup on the aircraft, but it looks like a sort of living lightning bolt. It's visually impressive, but harmless. Unfortunately, this wasn't St. Elmo's fire. After we had unloaded our passengers, my first officer came to get me. He was excited and jabbering on about how he'd found something weird on the post-flight inspection. What was his name? I remember I liked him, but I just can't recall why. I guess it doesn't matter now anyway. What he found was enough to intrigue and unnerve me. On the right main gear strut was something that looked very much like St. Elmo's fire. It was impossible, of course, for it to be there without the airplane moving. That alone should have been enough to caution me against further investigation, but it wasn't. I didn't make that connection. It didn't move its position, but it did sort of internally change with an undulation of shape and a shifting of color. It kept changing colors in a rhythmic, almost seductive way, compelling my subconscious mind, beckoning for me to make contact with it. The light captivated me. As soon as I touched it, I felt a current flow through me, and when it did, the cryptic electrical apparition disappeared. I now suspect that it entered me like a malevolent infection. Just like an infection, there was an incubation period. A few uneventful days passed, filled with the mundane rituals of everyday life, and then I began hearing things. Not voices, but a dry, scratching sound, like dragging the needle across a record. At first I thought it was tinnitus, but it wasn't. It was the beginning of all this lunacy. A week or so later, I can't really recall how long it was, the sound started getting louder. I had just checked into a hotel room when the scratching sounds reached their peak, but to attempt to describe it as a sound reaching its peak is a mundane description which does nothing to communicate the pain it caused. Mind-shattering crescendo is a better description. I remember running into the hall screaming, trying to drown out the noises in my mind. There was a man in the lobby, staring at me in either disgust or fear as I ran past him, banging my fists against my temples. I can only imagine the spectacle I must have been. I was still in uniform, running, screaming, drenched in sweat, writhing in pain. All my thrashing did nothing to stop the torrent of agony coursing through my mind. Unable to stand it anymore, I fell to the ground. But my agony only increased until finally it was too much for me to even move, and I lay on the floor. Every nerve in my body felt as if it were on fire. Then, to my relief, it simply stopped. Like somewhere in my body, a fuse had blown. Now that I think of it, it was more like a capacitor discharging. But I had no idea that it would begin charging again. I looked up to find my surroundings had changed, but at first I was too elated to have the torturous experience end to even care. I remember I lay there for quite some time, enraptured by the silence and calm, the sun warming my now peaceful body. When I finally rose to my feet, I discovered myself in the middle of a residential street. I was worried that a car might hit me, and so I ran to the sidewalk. At first, I had believed myself to have run all the way there, the pain making me forget myself. Perhaps I had passed out, but the reality of my situation still eluded me. With no real destination in mind and simply wanting to start moving, I began walking. After a few minutes, it occurred to me to use the GPS on my phone to figure out exactly where I was. I think I was still so happy to not be in pain anymore that I didn't notice the obvious. Not one car traveled down the street on whose sidewalk I traveled. The lawns of all the homes were overgrown with weeds, and the homes themselves were in disrepair. No, I did not notice those things. With the sun warming my body, I blissfully walked happily on. It wasn't until I checked my phone for a third time, and for a third time it had no signal, did I actually start examining my surroundings. Confusion set in as I scanned my environment. How did I get there? Where was I? Where was everyone? These questions darted through my mind, and eager to have answers, I convinced myself that I had stumbled into a failed residential development. My mind was grasping to make sense of what was going on, but deep down inside me, the seed of fear had taken root. It was midday, and the sun, which had calmed me with its warmth, now seemed to be blistering my skin with its rays. I persuaded myself that if I just kept walking in one direction, that I would eventually find my way back to a part of the city with people, traffic, and noise. The silence of the community I was ambulating through became apparent at some point during my futile search for others. People who aren't pilots probably don't realize this, but in any major metropolitan area, if you listen long enough, you will hear the drone of aircraft as they pass overhead. I don't think I was consciously afraid until hours into my trek when I realized I had heard no jets, no distant traffic, nothing but the wind. I'm still not sure where the citizens of that town went. In fact, I will probably never know what happened there. Several miles of walking behind me, I started shouting in an attempt to draw people to me. I screamed until my voice was hoarse and yelling was no longer within my abilities. There was no reply, spare the wind, which was increasing in force. At the brink of panic, an idea came to me when I saw a radio tower next to a school playground. My intention was to climb it and gather information on my surroundings. By now, I had developed the hypothesis that the city had been evacuated owing to some sort of terrorist attack. Perhaps my mental break had even been caused by my fictional extremist assault. So confident was I in my analysis of the situation that I was misconnecting my observations to create even more evidence for it. I must not have seen any cars because they had all been driven to safety. None of the traffic lights worked because the power had been cut to this section of the city in a bid to slow the progress of whatever was going on. Never mind the fact that for my theory to have been validated, every car in the city would have needed to be in perfect running order with full gas tanks, and that shutting off the power would have hindered any first responders as well. As any rational person can see, I was totally wrong. In hindsight, I can see how absurd my thinking was, but as I approached the playground, I was quite sure of my faulty analysis. I thought that if I could get high enough on the tower, I would see the direction in which I would need to travel in order to get to the edge of the quarantined area. Reaching the tower took more effort than I had anticipated. It was surrounded by a chain-link fence topped by concertina wire. I walked around the periphery looking for some obvious way to get in, but found none. Then I walked around the fence again, this time shaking each of the metal fence posts. Finding them all to be well seated and resistant to my cajoling, it became obvious to me that I would not be easily admitted to the other side. I gave up on the idea and headed back to my original route. As I began my trek anew, I passed a swing set on the playground. One of the swings was broken. Its seat was bisected from years of use. More interesting to me, however, was the chain which was attached to the broken seat, and it gave me an idea. With some degree of effort and an even greater degree of luck, I was able to push the retaining pin out of place with a long branch, thus freeing it for use in my little scheme. I returned to the chain-link fence encircling the tower with an approximately 8-foot length of chain, which I set about looping through the links in the fence. Then, using the branch I had used to remove the retaining pin, I began twisting the chain, causing the links to give way and opening a hole just large enough for me to squeeze through. Once inside, I was confronted by my next obstacle. The ladder did not begin until around 12 feet from the ground. I assumed that technicians who maintained the antenna brought their own ladder, but I was lacking such a luxury. I instead used the chain and branch as a sort of grappling hook with which I was able to surmount the antenna. What I saw as I climbed made less and less sense and provided more questions than answers. The sun was setting and the orange and red of the evening was quite breathtaking, but the city itself was dead. There was no movement as far as my eyes could see. No lights at all, no cars, and, most disturbing, no people. It was a city totally devoid of humans. The cold wind did nothing for my mood, and I decided to make my way down while there was still some light in order to more easily find some place to take shelter for the night. My decision in where to spend the night was made less out of careful thought and more out of convenience. I surveyed the homes nearest the playground and decided on a house that looked to be the most structurally secure. The others in the vicinity had large trees overhanging their roofs, and with the wind now howling, I thought it best to pick one which had no danger from falling limbs. Expecting a locked door and difficulty gaining access, I again took up my tree branch and headed to the front door. My plan was to break a window, gain access, and then spend the night in a part of the house away from the damage I caused. I found it unlocked, but decided to carry the branch for use as a bludgeon in case there were any wild animals inside. You see, I hadn't experienced the creature yet, so I still did not know what I should have truly been afraid of. I would never choose a place so indefensible again. It is only through sheer luck and a little quick thinking I survived the night. The home was furnished with nondescript furniture. It was neither richly appointed nor Spartan. Some of the furniture still had tags affixed to them, giving me the impression that they were brand new when the owners had left. With the exception of a thin layer of dust, even the carpet was spotless. I was considering all of this when I began to shiver. The temperature was dropping fast, and I hastily made a fire with wood that was neatly stacked near the fireplace, lighting it with long-handled matches I found in a container aptly labeled matches. After making the fire and warming myself by it, my attention turned to the contents of the home again. I noticed there were no pictures on the wall, no paintings, nothing personal about the room I was in. In the kitchen, the refrigerator still had its owner's manual tucked neatly in a plastic sheet and taped to the front. I dared not open it, lest the stench of rotting food be released into my temporary abode. I laid down in front of the fire, but sleep eluded me. In truth, I hardly ever sleep well anymore. That night my mind was occupied with the bizarre situation I was in. I started getting worried about radiation, with images of the abandoned town of Pripyat near the ill-fated Chernobyl filling my brain. The lack of any sort of clue whatsoever perplexed me. Where did the residents go? After seeing the dust inside the home, I started wondering how long they had been gone. Unable to sleep, I searched the home by the light of a candle I took from the home's kitchen. There was to be found no hint as to who had owned the home. Empty dressers, closets, and medicine cabinets seemed to mock my attempts at investigation. In the master bedroom, I found a gun safe and tried to crack the combination with my ear against its cold metal case for a few minutes before giving up entirely. I know in my heart that even if I had succeeded in opening it, it would have been empty. Picture frames lined the hallway, but they held no pictures. Why would they take the pictures, but not the frame? Feeling defeated and more than a little exhausted, I took some blankets from the linen closet and made a makeshift bed in front of the fireplace. Perhaps, I thought, having a more comfortable place to sleep would help me drift off. Out of habit, I took my uniform off and hung it neatly on the back of a rocking chair in the living room. I remember it made me chuckle that I would be so concerned about keeping my uniform in a civil state, given the events of the day. It was the first time I had laughed since appearing in that lonely place. The wind was howling now, the sky erupting with light and sound from a thunderstorm. Something unsettling in my mind, like a familiar fear, compelled me to lock the front door. No sooner had I locked the deadbolt than it shook with a terrible force. I jolted backwards, and in doing so dropped my candle. The room went black as my eyes struggled to adjust. From the outside, I could have sworn I heard a low, watery growl. Placing entirely too much confidence in the locked door, I crept forward, pressing my ear against the door, but heard nothing except the rain that was now falling in droves. From across the house, maybe in the garage, I heard an angry, metallic banging which shook the walls of the home. Trembling with fear, I forced my hands to be still as I lit another match, using its light to return to the living room where the fire was starting to die down. My heart was racing, the banging growing louder and more insistent. It sounded as though something was trying to break its way in through the side of the house with a sledgehammer. I looked for anything I could use as a weapon. A fire poker, which I had accidentally left in the flame, was the obvious choice. The handle was too hot to hold, and I wrapped my shirt around my hand to keep from searing my flesh while I held it. Wielding it like a sword, there was nothing in that moment that could have persuaded me to drop it. Just having something in my hand made me feel a small bit more prepared and ready for a fight. The banging stopped and was almost immediately followed by an ominous snarl. Whatever this beast was, it continued its threatening noise as it circled the house, returning to the far side of the home after having walked around the home 2 more times. The banging started again at a more fevered pace until the unthinkable happened. Siding and drywall gave way with a horrible crashing sound. I stood motionless as a stench began to fill my nostrils. It was the smell of rotten flesh, the odor of death and decay, and it grew stronger as the sound of the animal's footfalls grew louder. I decided to put myself with my back to the wall that separated the hall from the living room, thus keeping myself from being silhouetted and an easier target for whatever was making its way down the hall toward me. The wet thudding of its footsteps stopped at the edge of the entryway. I could hear it breathing. Each breath was long and labored, sounding like a low gurgling, and the acrid smell it emitted made it harder for me to breathe. It must have sensed I was near because it waited there for a torturous amount of time. Without further warning, it sprang into the living room, all 4 legs splayed out like a dog tensing its body to attack. Resembling a human-sized cat which had been skinned, its head searched the room for me. As soon as its gaze fell upon my face, its face twisted itself in rage, and it stood up on its hind legs. Its face was a bizarre mix of human eyes and nose and curved, extended jaw, festooned with teeth and dripping with what I can only guess was a dark saliva. The initial fear which had prevented me from moving gave way to my need for self-preservation. I swung my makeshift cudgel with all my might. It connected with the sound of bone crushing and flesh searing. The creature let out a rageful yelp as it fell, falling onto its back, obliterating the rocking chair behind it. In an instant, it was back on its 4 legs, tensing to jump, and I again swung, but this time, it was too fast. With lightning-like speed, it rolled to its right and launched its massive body towards me, its yellow teeth exposed as its massive jaw opened wide. Without thinking, I jammed my poker deep into its mouth, down its throat. A sound of hot metal burning flesh could be heard as the poker tore its way down the animal's gullet. Twisting in pain, the creature fell within inches of my feet and began violently swinging its head. Its paw-like hands worked feverishly to remove my spear. When it succeeded, it vomited its stomach contents all over the floor, then contemptuously stared at me for a brief moment before retreating down the hall and out of the house. Acerbic fumes from its emesis and a faint crackling from the fire filled the room. Outside, the rain had stopped, and an unnerving quiet filled the home. Placing the poker back into the fire to reheat it in case the beast came back, I glanced at the stomach contents. Several human fingers could be seen in various states of decay. Pink nail polish revealed to me that they belonged to a woman. As disturbing as this revelation was, it was the ear which made me retch, adding my bile to the mix. The ear had an earring, one of those that dangle, and at the end of it was a metal heart. This was the kind of jewelry a teenager might wear, and that thought was too much to bear. I turned and faced the fire, its glow oddly frightening and calming simultaneously. I wish I could write that I quickly composed myself and did something heroic, perhaps chased the vile creature down and killed it. Sadly, I did not. What I did was stand in front of that fire, feeding it logs to keep it going until dawn arrived. In the morning, I put my clothes back on, careful to not look in the direction of the girl's remains, and went into the kitchen. While the cupboards were bare, actually, had they ever even had any food in them? Oh. The drawers were filled with utensils. Among them was a fish fillet knife around 6 inches long, in a scabbard. I hung this on my belt and then decided to take a butcher knife with me as well. Around my shoulder and waist I wrapped the chain I had used yesterday. I am sure I looked ridiculous, but vanity was a concept I could no longer afford. Heading back into the living room, I took the container of matches and then walked cautiously to the front door. There was no peephole, so I slowly opened it and peered out. When I was satisfied there was no immediate danger, I went out in search of answers and food. Whatever little food still remained in my stomach after arriving in that godforsaken place had been deposited atop some poor girl's remains the previous night. The first thing I noticed after stepping outside was the smell. It wasn't the creature's smell, but it wasn't pleasant. It reminded me of wet dog. Regardless of the odor, I ventured forth. There were again no cars, no sounds, and no people. Today, however, I elected not to yell for help. I was far too worried that I might attract the attention of whatever had attacked me in the night. Instead, I walked slowly, turning around frequently to assure I wasn't being followed. I had now come to grips with the fact that I was either totally insane or was involved in something supernatural. I resolved to gather food, weapons, and information on my situation. After more mindless walking, I came across a gas station. It had 4 pumps, each standing ready for non-existent customers. It also had a large glass front window. As I approached the window, I was delighted to see a rotating rack filled with maps. My first instinct was to rush in and find out where I was, but remembering my encounter during the night, I was more careful. Instead, I stood there and examined the inside for danger. After moving from one end of the window to another and carefully looking for any sign of peril, I went to the front door, but found it locked. I took a few steps back and then tried to kick the door in. I guess I've seen too many action movies because I expected it to fly open with the mighty force of my foot. It did not. What it did do was cause me to fall backwards, landing hard on my rear end. Curiously, I stood up quickly and looked around to see if anyone had seen me embarrass myself. It's just one of the little learned actions that you do when you're raised in a civilized world. After I had a little laughed about my concern for the opinions of people who did not exist, I tried again, and again, and again. It took me several attempts at kicking the door before it finally gave way with a loud crack. Inside was a layer of dust like in the house, which I used to determine that I was indeed alone. The only footprints in the establishment were my own, and I walked around the periphery of the building to assure myself of this fact. With a cautious relief, I went to the map rack. All of the maps were of places I had never heard of. Road maps for the state of Sequoia, which apparently is the native state, and Durst, billing itself as the launch pad for the future, were arranged neatly. Confused, but growing less surprised by the moment, I went behind the cashier station and found a phone book. It was labeled Telebook for the New Arlington metro area. Staring at the strange name and label, I decided to find a police station. I figured there might be guns of some kind there, and when the sun set, I could sleep in one of the jail cells using the chain to close and lock the door. I made a mental note to look for a padlock while I was shopping. There was no listing for police in the government pages, but there were several listings under the title Constabulary. From the window behind the cash register, I could see what intersection I was at. I can't remember what the 2 street names were now, though, and in any event, it doesn't matter. From there, I consulted the map and found the nearest constable station was 3 blocks from where I was. Finally, I had a destination and a purpose in mind. It is amazing what having even a tiny goal can do for your mental well-being when you're in such dire circumstances. Before leaving, I gorged myself on candy labeled with bright colors and potato chips labeled in the European fashion as crisps. Then I used a plastic bag from the register to stock up on food, a flashlight with extra batteries, cigarette lighters, a first aid kit, a couple of magazines for later research, a padlock, and, of course, the maps. I took a moment to mark the location of the constable station and hospital on my city map, and then noticed a strange thing on the chart. On the other side of the city, the westernmost point, if it matters, a road ended at a blue ring labeled Gateway. Curiosity made me circle it, and I figured that if I lived long enough, I would try to make my way there and find out what a gateway was. I made one more sweep around the aisles to see if I needed anything else, and then set out to find the constable's office. Having my stomach filled with food, I was able to think more clearly, and although I'm sure what I had eaten was far past its expiration date, I felt no ill effects. I was actually starting to feel pretty good when I smelled the stench from the house again. The wind had blown it to me, probably from far off, but I froze in my tracks. I held my butcher knife near my chest. Slowly, I turned around, expecting to see it snarling at me, but there was nothing. A moment later, the breeze died down, and with it the stench. I knew it was close, and I could guess based on the wind it was some distance behind me, but I heard and saw nothing. With adrenaline coursing through my veins, I ran at full pace to the constable's station. If it didn't know where I was when I first smelled it, I'm sure it did after the rattling of chains and rustling of assorted stolen goods in my bag. As I ran, I heard the noises I was making, but I couldn't seem to will myself to stop until I reached my destination. Racing around the corner, I saw the station ahead. It was the first time I noticed things in a state of disarray in the city. There were bright orange barricades placed in the parking lot, along with large spray-painted signs proclaiming, "Violence will be met with violence," and "All travelers must be registered." As I got closer, I saw that the barricades were arranged into lanes which snaked their way to the front door of the station. The front door had been glass, but now lay shattered in the doorway. I hesitated at the door's threshold, but another whiff of the thing that was hunting me was enough to encourage me inside. With glass crunching under my feet, I saw the remains of a pitched life-and-death struggle. Bullet holes riddled blood-stained walls, the bodily fluids now brown with age. Before venturing further inside, I moved several chairs to block the front door. While it would in no way be able to stop the demonic thing, it would certainly make enough noise for me to hear it if it followed me in. With the makeshift barrier complete, I started further into the apparent war zone. Ambient light faded away as I traveled further inside, and I was glad I had taken a flashlight from the gas station. The light from it showed spent shell casings littered the floor, which added to the impression of mayhem long past. Like in the house and the gas station, a fine layer of dust covered everything. Unlike in those places, this location showed definite signs of human life and probably death. The hall ended in a sort of waiting room with a large desk opposite chairs which had been knocked over in the struggle. Upon the desk was a plaque which read, "Lieutenant of the Day." On top of the desk was a logbook which was open. The last entry was about transit pass processing, but made no sense to me. Furthermore, under the column labeled date, there appeared letters and not numbers. Behind the lieutenant's desk, and separated from the room by a waist-high wall which was knocked down in places, were office spaces. Certificates and awards were framed above workstations, and family photos were there to give me a glimpse at the people who once worked and possibly perished in this place. I know I looked at as many of these pictures as I could, and with the exception of one, they could have been pictures of my friends and neighbors and their families. The one that did stand out is stuck in my mind. Even with my fading memory, I don't think this image will soon leave my brain. It was a hunter's trophy picture, but the animal she was proudly posing over was like nothing I have ever seen. It must have been some sort of carnivorous pachyderm, massive in size, like an elephant whose trunk had been replaced with the mouth of a huge crocodile. I'm quite sure that nothing like it exists on Earth. However, wherever I was, it had apparently been a prized game animal. Another odd thing about the workstations was the lack of computers or monitors. It wasn't that they had been removed, it was that they simply weren't there. In their place was paperwork, office supplies, and reel-to-reel tape recorders. I looked for any evidence of a computer and found nothing. Still further back was a desk replete with archaic-looking radios, knobs and dials covering them. They looked like something straight out of World War II. My impression at that time was that these people had a much lower level of technology than we do. Behind the radio equipment was a doorway with a sign which read, "Constables Only." My flashlight revealed the door to have been broken inward, and the beam illuminated a long corridor behind it. Inside this area, the decor changed to institutional. A gray cement floor with gray walls. At the far end was the jail cell I had been looking for. I say at the far end of the hall, but in reality, the hall wrapped around the periphery of the cell. Like something straight out of an Old West movie, it boasted thick steel bars which ran from floor to ceiling. Inside was a toilet-sink combo, and steel benches lined 3 of the 4 walls. I hurried to the other side of this holding cell and was frustrated in finding it locked. My disappointment turned to excitement when I noticed the door was controlled by a series of pulleys and cables which ran to a lever on the side of the hall. The control lever was placed well out of reach to anyone in the cell. With a great amount of pulling, I was able to move the lever. The door made a groaning noise and opened a few inches. It was a very heavy door, but I was able to pull it open. I could hardly believe my luck. Surveying the whole setup, I was delighted to see that I could use the chain and padlock to secure myself inside. It would be like having my own personal shark cage, except in this case it was not a shark I was trying to keep out, but rather some sort of otherworldly monster. My accommodations secure, I began settling in. I put my grocery sack of supplies down on the bench and looked for the best place to sleep. In doing so, I noticed the body underneath. It looked like a mummy, dressed in an orange jumpsuit. Its lips were drawn back against its teeth, giving it the appearance of a permanent smile. Whatever had happened there had stranded this prisoner in his cell. I suppose he probably starved to death, as I saw no obvious signs of trauma. For the authorities to have abandoned someone to die like that led me to believe that what had happened quickly and unexpectedly. Once again, I must profess that I will probably never know the events of that place. The corpse, although lacking smell, disgusted me and convinced me to resume my search of the area. I started to look for what I thought would have been the ultimate prize to find, specifically a gun. Each room of the constable's only area of the station seemed to be devoted to interrogation or interview. They all had one large table with 2 chairs on one side and another opposite those 2. Each time I opened the door to find another similarly appointed room, my hopes for success diminished. Even though I was becoming more and more disheartened, I resolved to conduct a complete search of the building. My thoroughness in checking every single door paid off, because the last room, in which I was fully prepared to see 3 chairs and a table, actually opened to a staircase which descended into a basement. I took a deep breath through my nose, trying hard to smell the scent of my pursuer, and, smelling nothing, I then crept down the stairs as quietly as I could. Reaching the landing, I was confronted with another desiccated corpse laying in front of a door. Clad in what I can only assume to be a constable's uniform, his head was resting in the opposite corner, fully 5 feet away from his body. Although the body was wearing a gun belt, it was wrapped from shoulder to the opposite waist, like he had grabbed it quickly and did not have time to put it on properly. The holster was empty, but I was encouraged by the fact that the pouches held several loaded magazines. I pushed in on the top cartridge and was glad to feel the tension push it back up as I let it go. When my little test revealed the spring was still good, I liberated the belt from the dead officer. Not wanting to make the same mistake he did, I properly fastened it around my waist. A set of keys were attached to the belt with a retractable chain, and as I suspected, I needed them soon. The door in the basement indicated it to be the Armory, and as you might presume, it was locked securely. Fortunately, the last constable in residence had seen fit to provide me with a set of keys to the station, and I was able to open the door with a twist of my wrist. Inside, I found chaos and emptiness that whispered of desperate times long past. The armory had been picked over. Rows and rows of gun racks stood empty. In front of them was a small desk and a chair with a heavy coat draped over the back. The floor was littered with empty cartridge boxes, loose ammunition, and assorted gun accessories. The stillness of the room stood in stark contrast to the frenzied disorder of its contents. Undaunted, I walked up and down each lane, searching deliberately for a weapon. Fortune rewarded me, and in the last rack of the last row was a magazine-fed rifle. Its design was unfamiliar to me. Tied to its trigger guard was a red tag which said it was unserviceable. The tag indicated the fault to be a broken rear post sight. I picked it up and examined the sight. It was indeed loose, moving left and right with a nudge from my finger, but beggars can't be choosers, and so I happily slung it on my shoulder. The magazines I found in the dead constable's gun belt were obviously for a pistol, and so my next order of business was to find a magazine and ammunition for the rifle. By the light of my flashlight, I crawled on the floor, picking up magazine after magazine, trying to fit them into the rifle. I probably tried close to 10 before one slid in with a satisfying click. Then the quest for ammunition began. I know enough about firearms to know that just because a cartridge can be chambered doesn't mean it's the right ammo. If I guessed at this part, my rifle might have exploded in my face. I looked carefully at the barrel for any markings that might tell me the caliber, but all I found were serial numbers and a string of letters. Remembering the lieutenant's log from upstairs, I picked up the closest cartridge and examined its casing. Sure enough, where a caliber should have been, there was a series of 4 letters. When it was all said and done, I had picked up 16 rifle cartridges, which had the same letter sequence as the barrel on my gun. After some tinkering, I was able to release the magazine from its well and load 12 rounds into it. The slide was easy enough to figure out, and as soon as I had loaded my rifle, I felt like $1 million. I put the 4 remaining cartridges in my breast pocket and started making my way back to my jail cell. On the way out, I noticed a sign which instructed everyone to sign out all weapons and ammunition with the armorer. Next to the door was a clipboard with names, what were probably their version of dates, and serial numbers. For a laugh, I used the attached pencil to write my name, the date. I don't remember what I wrote, but I know it was the day after I arrived, and back then I still knew what day it was, and the serial number from my rifle. The last column was for expected duration of weapon use, and for that I wrote perpetual. Remembering the previous night had been cold, even with a fire, I took the coat from the chair in front of the weapons racks. The back of the dark blue coat had the word constable written in reflective letters, and the front sported a 5-point star. How funny, I thought, that yesterday I broke into someone's house, and now I was the only constable in town. The creature was very near me when I opened the armory door. Its smell accosted me instantly. Being so far in the building and behind a heavy door, I didn't hear the chairs being knocked over when it came in. I quickly turned off the flashlight and listened for its footsteps or breathing. I heard a crinkling sound from the floor above, then scraping, then crinkling again. I realized that it was inside the jail cell, and the crinkling was from the grocery bag and potato chips inside. I quickly developed a plan. If I could trap it in the cell, I would be able to kill it with ease, regardless of the accuracy of my rifle. With as much stealth as I could manage, I ascended the stairs, nudging the door open. I could still hear the crinkling and crunching of the animal. Choking back my own urge to vomit at the smell, I moved into the hallway. I had no light at all, so I was moving based on memory and what I could feel. The door to the cell should have been in front of me and to my left. Beyond that, on the opposite wall, was the locking lever. I was now faced with a dilemma. One option was to walk straight ahead, past the open door with Satan's little pet ready to munch on me, throw the lever, and close the door. This course of action would have taken the least amount of time but exposed me to the greatest risk. The other option was to walk around the cell, avoiding the open door but increasing my chance of being discovered by making some noise. I chose the circuitous plan and began slowly feeling my way around the cell. When I had reached the wall with the lever, the sound of the animal examining my plastic bag stopped. I froze, estimating that it was still several feet away from the mechanism. I needed to draw it to the far side of the cell to give me enough time to throw the lever and then close the door. But now it wasn't making any noise. I had no idea where it was. I couldn't see anything. I couldn't hear anything, but it was still in there with me. Of that I was sure. That awful stink was so strong I could taste rotten flesh on my tongue. That's when I had the idea to throw something to make a noise and draw it away from me. I reached into my shirt pocket and grabbed one of the cartridges. Silently, I tossed it toward where I thought the back of the jail was. Instead of a loud clattering, I heard a dull thump followed by the sound of the bullet hitting the concrete floor. In a flash, I realized that the bullet had first hit the animal and then the ground. It was out of the cage in the same hall with me. I shouldered my rifle and pointed it in the general direction I had thrown the bullet. As soon as I had the barrel raised, I squeezed off a round. The strobe-like light of the gun firing affirmed my fears. Not only was it out of the cell, it was less than 6 feet from me, moving towards me. My first shot was way off, and I knew it. I pointed my rifle towards where the last shot had shown my adversary to be, and fired again. This time the flash showed it closer to me. However, this shot found its mark. The creature yelped as the bullet tore into it. Having zeroed in on my opponent, I continued firing, but each flash showed the damned thing in a different place and moving away from me. After the 6th shot, the creature had retreated from the constable's area. Quickly, I turned my flashlight on, shining it down the hall where I pointed my weapon. I remained there, aiming my weapon until eventually the smell faded, and I knew it had retreated from my vicinity. When I heard the chairs I had piled up in front of the entrance, I knew it had left the building. I now know that if someone's hands are shaking, it doesn't necessarily mean they are scared. In my case, I wasn't scared, but the leftover adrenaline was making my whole body quiver. Simply keeping my flashlight in the same place was almost impossible. With my fine muscle control completely out the window, it took some time for me to get the door closed and attach the padlock. When that was done, I sat on the bench, and with great, deliberate movements, I was able to put the remaining 3 rounds into the magazine. I shined my flashlight around the room, searching for the cartridge I had thrown, and found it laying against the wall, out of reach to me inside the cell. I decided to retrieve it in the morning, after I had slept. It was still early afternoon, but after not sleeping the night before and finally feeling secure inside my cell, I decided to get some shut-eye. I don't know how long I slept, but when I awoke, I momentarily thought everything I had experienced was a horrible dream, that the past 2 days had been the excited cogitations of a weary mind. As soon as I became aware of the ringing in my ears, however, I remembered the last encounter with the monstrous animal. The reality of my situation settled back into my mind. With great effort, I sat up before turning on my flashlight. I sniffed the air for that now familiar smell of decaying flesh. My olfaction warned me of no danger, and so I gathered my things up, left the safety of my quarters, and headed out to find the gateway. I had to keep my mind occupied to prevent the ever-present fear of death from consuming me. Further emboldened by my newfound rifle and confident that I would smell any danger before it was upon me, I decided to risk traveling to the enigmatic blue circle on my map. When I reached the entrance to the constable's station, the sun was just rising, but the air was decidedly cold. I pulled the collar of the armorer's coat up to keep the frigid breeze from assaulting my neck. By now, I was determined to solve the mystery of New Arlington. I had this thought in my mind that I had been brought here for some cosmic reason beyond my understanding. Everyone was gone except me, and I didn't belong here. Did the creature belong there? I would have said no, but after seeing that picture in the constable's office, I was not so sure. Was it possible this was some sort of huge but normal wildlife? Writing this now, I can tell you that no, neither I nor that damned thing belonged in that city. At the time, however, I considered it a very real possibility. My mind was fully preoccupied with determining exactly how I had gotten there, where there was, and what had happened to everyone. Because of this mental obsession, I did not notice the wallet which was in the coat I was wearing. I found it later in the day when I had stopped for lunch. I sat down to eat after a full morning's walk through lonely streets. As the sun had climbed in the sky, the temperature had grown too hot to continue wearing my coat. Okay, so it wasn't really mine. And I took it off. When I did, I noticed it was heavier on one side than the other, and found there to be a zippered pocket which contained a brown trifold wallet. Opening a package of sugary confectionaries and stuffing my face with them, I examined the contents of the wallet. There was a driver's license, bearing the image of a man in his mid-40s who was balding. His name escapes me, and right now I'm too lazy to dig it out of my backpack to write it down. Anyway, the license was interesting to me because his photo had been laminated on top of a piece of cardstock, and each of the fields for name, age, etc. were filled in by hand. Not being printed on plastic lent more credence to my working theory that this place and its residents had a much lower level of technology. But then, I found a credit card size metallic ID card. There was a 1-inch by 2-inch square on the left side, and the right side had etched into it all of this man's information. Underneath the square, it simply read, "Thumb." I turned it over and found it to have a very precise etching of this man's face, and next to it a series of geometric symbols. I stared at this object, turning it over, and then pressed my thumb to the black square. When I did, a red circle with a green square inside appeared over the man's information, flashed 3 times, and then disappeared. I removed my thumb and then put it back, only to have it happen again. I've never seen anything like it. I think it was checking my thumbprint against the constable's. This metal object was no thicker than a business card, but was able to check my fingerprint and illuminate some sort of message as well. It is also worth mentioning that it bore no markings to indicate what it was for, just his vitals and the symbols on the back. There went my technological backwater theory. The rest of the wallet contained mundane things like a library card and some business cards. Sadly, there was no currency inside. I feel like I could have learned a lot from seeing what the currency looked like. Looking back, I should have gone to the library and checked out a history book. But I digress. The rest of the walk was filled with myriad empty houses and businesses. I kept hoping for a gun store or even a sporting goods store, but found none on my path. At the end of the road, what I did find was a checkpoint. The guard post was a simple shack. Behind the shack, the road continued for a short while and then became a bridge over a precipice. Just before the road became a bridge, there was a thick yellow line painted. The bridge ended abruptly, and I am sure that anyone who would have driven over it would have perished. I quickly consulted my map and found that I had indeed arrived at the gateway. I pulled a middle folding chair out of the guard shack and sat in the roadway, staring at the most anticlimactic end to my trek. As I stared at this bridge to nowhere, it occurred to me that I ought to at least walk out a ways. That way I would be able to tell myself that I had gone as far as I possibly could in search of answers. I pondered this thought for more than a little while, because I am afraid of heights. Not all heights. Flying doesn't bother me, nor does climbing a ladder or tree. My phobia is standing on top of elevated platforms, especially when there is wind. Well, here was an elevated platform and the ever-present wind. After much mental deliberation, I was able to talk myself into traveling up to the point where the road became a bridge. As I crossed the yellow line, I heard a voice. It addressed me as constable and asked me to stand by for transit instructions. There were no speakers to be seen. I walked back across the line and the voice bid me a good day. Intrigued, I crossed over the line again and was again told to stand by for transit instructions. This voice was obviously recording. It sounded identical to the first time I'd heard it. Waiting for transit instructions sounded like a good idea to me, so I waited. Then I waited some more. Finally, a different voice was heard. This one was female and simply asked who I was. In my most official voice, I declared I was Captain Richard Blackburn. More time passed, and I called out again, hello or hi or something. There was no response. I'm not sure why, but after a while I simply shouted, help me. Her reply was, in my estimation, also an apology. It was, I can't. I kept asking questions like, where was I? What was this place for? Why can't you help me? And on and on. She remained mute, and I never heard her voice again. I walked a little bit farther towards the edge of the bridge, and that's when the noise in my ear started again. There was no denying it was the same sound as when I touched that electrical disturbance on my airplane. I knew what was coming next. Though my soul was crushed by her words and the sounds in my ears, I made haste to return to my secure jail cell for the night. I smelled the creature 2 times on the way back, but didn't see it. Each time my nose detected its foul odor, I would put my back to the nearest wall and wait, rifle at the ready, until the smell passed. After I was confident I was no longer in danger, I would continue my sprinting and then walking. When I arrived, I noticed something strange in the dust of the station. Some small someone, wearing combat boots, had been walking around the radio area. Clearly written in the dust on top of the desk was RB and an arrow. The arrow pointed to a desk drawer which I had not opened. Inside I found a pistol, 2 bottles of water, and a handwritten note. I saved the note. Here's what it says, word for word. Captain Blackburn, all lowercase. This is all I can do to help, all lowercase. Stay away from the transit point or they will kill you. Capital R in transit and capital U in you. Horror Verde was just a misfire. This is not, with a capital N. Signed, NN. I've no idea what Horror Verde is, but I am smart enough to pick out the letters R, U, and N. I would have taken her coded suggestion, but run where? I still didn't even know where I was, so running would have been pointless. I took everything but her advice. The pistol was an especially welcome gift. While it did not take the ammunition in my belt, it did fit in the holster. Kind of. That night I drank both waters. I didn't realize it, but I hadn't had a drink in quite some time. Before I went to sleep, I locked myself in the cell again, spread out my map, and thought about my next move. I had made contact with someone at the gateway, but she had advised me against ever returning, and I was inclined to listen to her. That ruled out going west again. The north side of New Arlington had several hospitals, and I considered foraging for supplies there. To the east was a large highway, but without a car, I didn't think traveling a highway would get me very far. South of me was an airport, but would there be any airplanes there? Even if there were, would the fuel have turned to sludge? In the final analysis, I made my decision based on the fact that I wasn't sick or injured. In the morning, I would try to get to the airport, unless that damned thing showed up again. After the long hike of the day, it felt good to take my shoes off, and sleep came shortly after. On this particular night, my unwelcome guest did not make an appearance. I suppose it was too busy eating little girls who could not defend themselves. I drifted off pondering who my mysterious benefactor was and trying to ignore the sounds in my ears. The ringing was much louder when I awoke. I recognize now that this is a sign of an impending shift, but I was judging my time left there based on the period between my first hearing the noise and shifting. As a result, the move took me by surprise. I checked my weapons, put on the gun belt, and slung my rifle over my shoulder. Reaching to unlock the padlock, the telltale smell of that horrible thing reached my nose. It grew stronger very quickly, and I knew it was coming for me. I set the flashlight down, facing the hallway from which it must approach, and waited, my rifle pointed down the only path toward me. Then the irritating noise began to grow in my mind. The pain started soon after. By the time I saw that crescent-shaped jaw skulking towards me, I could barely keep my eyes open because of the pain in my head. I squeezed the trigger, but my aim was affected by the throbbing agony between my ears. The shot ricocheted off the steel bars of my cell. The beast flung itself off the ground and hurled itself onto the bars which separated us. I tried to maneuver my rifle with a modicum of accuracy and fired again. Once more, my aim was worthless. My head felt like it was tearing itself apart, turning inside out. Crippled by the pain, I fell forward, face first onto the floor. Over the noise in my mind, I could hear it snarling in anger. Finally, I was unable to move. I just lay there, face down, wanting to die, needing the pain to kill me. What a wretched place to die, I thought, just before slipping into unconsciousness.